I'm Eric Chemi, and this is Politely Pushy. Welcome to Politely Pushy. I'm your host, Eric Chemi. Today we're talking about the medical industry, healthcare, and of course, AI, how those two things are going to work together. My guest today is Anthony Brooke. He's the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer at DrFirst's. Anthony, thanks so much for joining me on the show.
Eric, thanks for having me.
I read an article today. It's funny. We had scheduled this, and all of a sudden, I read an article today. It got CNBC, the New York Post, a lot of places. It said free Chat GPT may incorrectly answer drug questions, study says. And then they go into all these percentages, how it's making up some answers. Only 10 of the 39 questions proposed by these pharmacists gave satisfactory answers. The rest of it were either inaccurate, incomplete, or didn't answer the question, all of that. So I'm seeing so many things these days about ChatGPT is going to find these crazy diseases that you can be diagnosed with that doctors can't find, or it's going to just make up medicines that you don't need. Where do you stand on this? When you hear headlines like that, what's your perspective on it?
So I think my perspective, and this one aligns with our own company at DrFirst's, we've been helping identify the right drug therapy for about 10 years now with AI, specifically not large ChatGPT style models, but ML models trained on millions upon millions of prescriptions, to where one of the areas that's easy for most people to understand, the directions on a script of how is it that you should take this particular prescription. That's something that our Smart Suite tools can go ahead and write that in, even if it's blank, because we can take the knowledge that we have about that particular drug therapy, how it's been used by other patients and other applications, the kinds of instructions that they have put there before, and substitute that. And that's super accurate. We always allow the provider to clean that up and to make their own decisions in that. But that's something we've been running for about, I think in production, about 7 years now.
So really quickly, if someone's coming in today, they don't know what DrFirst does, right?
Yeah.
How do they see it? Is it something that a person would interact with directly, or is it that medical companies, doctors' offices, hospitals, are they the ones who are buying it? If I am a normal person who is just a patient, how does DrFirst help me?
All right. The way I simplify our business is I say about 30% of all prescriptions in the United States, in one shape or another, have touched DrFirst software. That doesn't mean we prescribed it through our software, but some piece, whether it's our AI helped clean up some of it, whether our medication history was what was used to help determine what the right prescription was, some aspect of our software. And the majority way that our software is used is not so much consumer facing, because we work on behalf of the doctor, like our namesake. And so with that, we're in the medical record system where the doctor, when they click prescribe, it's DrFirst software that actually enables that prescription. Or on the other side, for the patients, I think this year, about 90 million Americans will have actually gotten a text message from us on behalf of the doctor that says, hey, I just prescribed you this, and we really want you to go pick it up at this pharmacy, whatever one was agreed on. And we generally have some kind of incentive or education in there to help get the person to be adherent and actually not just get a prescription, but actually go pick up the prescription and then refill.
Actually go pick it up. I think a lot of
actually go pick it up.
Picked up. Yeah. And do you have data on something like how many prescriptions just never get picked up?
A bazillion. So I don't have the percentage off the top
Bazillion
of my head, but
number.
It's actually a really, really large percentage, unfortunately. And it comes from a lot of reasons. People are a little bit afraid of being embarrassed to see whether or not their insurance covers it or doesn't cover it, and how much will it cost. That tends to be one of the large concerns. Others is that they didn't want to say something to the provider if it makes me feel weird. And so they have a concern about what it's like to physically take that particular drug therapy. And so we try and give them the mechanisms to ask those questions.
I'm seeing in my little quick search here, 50% of refills aren't getting picked up. That is, and then 25% of new prescriptions. That's enormously higher than I would have expected. I would have thought maybe 10%, maybe 30%, but that's a massive number. And I didn't think about it as a cost point of view. I thought maybe people think, oh, I feel better now, I don't need it. But I didn't think about the cost, because you're right. You don't know what the cost is till you get there.
You don't. And so that's another one of our product services, depending on if you happen to use it or not. Doctors can choose to actually let the patient know at the time they're prescribing. We'll go look up their benefits and send it in.
So yeah, well, there's so much to talk about, in there, but I want to get back to this AI idea, because here we are, the end of 2023. We're looking at 2024. Generative AI is taken off. It was exactly a year ago, right? The chat.
That's right. That's right.
So I sort of feel like 2023 was the year of all of this. Now it's, can we put it into practice? Can we do something with it? Can we make a real impact in a good way, right? What are you seeing for next year? What are the conversations that you're having behind the scenes with some of your partners and customers? What are we going to actually see in the industry as a result of the technology that's now available?
Great question. So, and one that I think is a very multi-layered question. Like everyone else who is trying to maintain a relevant software business in today's world, we have to have an AI strategy. And we start out with, all right, we already have an AI strategy. We've done this for a bunch of years. But you're right that GPT chat in particular has brought forward a class of generative AI and brought it to that forefront that people are thinking about it differently. And it sort of brought it home. And I think that's the exciting innovation, is to see how can we harness that for something meaningful and something useful, to where it becomes not exciting anymore, but sort of boring, because things really are done in the background for you. And one of the areas that I've taken particular interest in around the textual side of generative AI is its ability to interpret intent. So not just keywords and matching. If you think about how we look things up, we tend to try and use the phrases and keywords, or the way we control our computer, we click specific commands, whether it's a click action, whether it's a voice command. It's a very specific preset defined series of commands we want to use. Generative AI gives us a new user interface, and almost a new paradigm. And there's a couple of early philosophies out there that it truly is a new user interface paradigm, to where you can interpret enough of a user's intent by having a conversation with them that'll drive new things. What is a practical application of that? This last year, our own company was learning around what's working, what's not, what can we connect, how could we too leverage some of the power behind this. We went through some of the internal efficiencies first before we went to external, and things like you can now chat with a document. And so one of the first things that we tried is we took something like 40,000 contracts and allowed our legal department to actually be able to chat with those. But like many other firms, we were a little concerned that at the time, OpenAI didn't have an enterprise license. And does that mean that we're taking our proprietary information and sending it off to the world somewhere out there that we don't have control? So we used GPT for All as a public open sourced project that we could run and host internally to start. And as we were maturing, that allowed us what it's like to say, instead of finding all of the contracts that have, does this have an insurance requirement, you could literally ask more of an intent question. We're not looking for keyword insurance, but rather, do we have to have this much insurance between this value to this value? And we got to experiment a lot with that. And so we worked a lot of different problems through summarization, because we found that was one of the things that this natural language interface is particularly good for. You can take a lot of data and summarize it. Most recently, even some of my product folks have been taking new regulations out, which are a couple hundred pages long. And we'll ask the new regulation published what it means. And what we found when you originally asked me about that concern around identifying drugs inappropriately, like the news article you read, if you point these tools to a specific base, and not say from all the information on the internet or everything you're connected to, but rather considering this document only, or this repository of documents, we haven't found that it has hallucinations or that it has problems. What we found is that the different models all interpret it slightly differently, like people might interpret the same information differently. And
Oh,
so
yeah.
we're building all of our tools to be interoperable with select your model of choice.
Interesting. So there's a lot here. So you mentioned intent. Like I never even thought about that. It's one thing to think, okay, the summary, but it's another thing to gauge intent out of what the question is trying to ask. Because we can do that as people. A lot of times it's sort of, okay, I know he said X, but what he's really trying to get at is something he doesn't want to explicitly say. Like, I think, is that what you're
That
getting
is
at in terms of
exactly it.
intent?
And
Okay.
so now think of software interface to where if it's interacting back and forth with a user, maybe we can just surface up the information you need because we know what your intent is. And we've worked this through a little bit with some of our folks on our own call center, our help desk line, where customers call in and they start explaining what an issue is. We've realized that our best performing customer support, they all have this intuitive notion, having experienced it, had the conversation, be like, oh, you got a new phone and I need you to take you through this fairly complex process of repairing a token. Got it. Even though that may not be what you said. Well, now we've actually done this to where some of our internal models are doing that as well. And then they're getting reinforced by that expertise of our folks that are kind of experts at that. And with that, we anticipate we'll get to a place where we're helping customer support just be that much faster simply by understanding what's the intent this person's really trying to get to.
Is this so? A couple of things. When you say intent, who's asking who? Then is this is a customer service question, or this is intent when you're talking to the document? Where exactly are these
So it's software in general. When you open software, you tend to have different purposes. And sometimes we might use roles and say, oh, I'm an administrator, so I get a different set of functionality. Or I'm a doctor, so I get a different set of functionality than maybe a physician assistant or a prescribing agent, right? And that's very common. We've had that role-based model on how we shift what's available. But what if we shifted what was available by intent? And we can ask the user or have the user express what it is they're after. Like, I need to write a prescription. Great. Is this a prescription for what we were just talking about 5 minutes ago? If so, I've already queued up half of it for you. Is it that you need to find some information in a contract, or are we editing a contract? Or are we looking for contracts that are similar to this? Are we trying to answer and find the information based on a series of contexts given to us by an inbound caller? So help desk, they can more easily match that inbound caller as a problem to a solution set that's common and repeatable that we already have. A lot to that, or you got it.
I'm thinking about that. I'm looking at my notes because then I'm also thinking about, like, because you had the token on the new phone example, right? But I'm thinking about what you said about chatting with a document. I never described it like that before. I would describe it as, I never thought like chatting with the document, because the document's not talking to me. But you're right. It's 200 pages or some massive number. You don't even think about how big these regulations are. I wouldn't even have thought one regulation could be 200 pages. I thought maybe 50, maybe not 200.
Right.
And it gets beyond the point that anyone can process it. So chatting with the document, and it's like the document is trying to summarize for you what is really the document all about, or what's in there, because no one's going to read it all.
Not just summarizing. So yes, you can use it for summarization, and we have that certainly, like everyone else. But I think where it becomes interesting is when you're asking it very pointed questions, such as, hey, which of these 40,000 contracts has a provision that we have to maintain $2 to $5 million of coverage for a specific thing? That's not something you can easily find through keywords, right? And the language is different.
There's so many
documents. You have like a very specific problem that you have this intent around what you're trying to find. And that's where I find that generative chat style has a definitive advantage over what we've done for statistical models in the past.
I know what you're saying, because there's so many things that I've searched for in the past that you know what you're trying to get at, but you don't know exactly which keyword they're going to use. And you type in all these different words, but you don't know exactly which, like tense, verb tense it uses, is it past or present, future. And there's synonyms. So that word may not be there, but the point of the word is in there somewhere. And then you never actually find it, even though I have the file that is talking about this thing.
So an example would be, there are companies out there that do sentiment analysis pretty well now.
Right.
And I can remember I worked with some time ago a company, Generative, where we were one of the larger feeders of their data and of patients' comments to a hospital. And they tend to be fairly complex, like humans are. That it's not just, is it good? Is it bad? Am I happy? Am I mad? But it's like, I was unhappy with the cleanliness of the bathroom. The room was cold, but the nurses were the friendliest, funniest people I've ever had. I couldn't have gotten through this without them. And there's a lot there to unpack. And so taking out that intent, you end up taking out those key concepts from that. That, I think, is now great. That was a way to analyze data post. How do we do that in real time so that we're adapting what's available for data, what's available for user interface for users in real time as they need it? So they're literally having that conversation with the document and then being able to get directly to what they need.
And who's the they? Who is the person having that conversation?
Anyone who would be developing software. For us, it tends to be the medical provider, the pharmacist, any one of the clinical staffs that's involved in medication management. That tends to be our user.
Okay, so they're the ones that would be going in there.
And they would get the byproduct. So we are currently in the proof of concept. It'll probably come out into some products you'll see, where we have a ambient listening. And so with that, we can listen to an interview like this and say, all right, here was the intent, here was what they were trying to come out with. But now put it into workflow and say, great, doctor was talking to patient and mentioned these 3 medications. 2 of them the patient's already on, so I'm going to assume that was historical. But this new one, they're not on that. Let's go ahead and queue up a script with all the defaults in it. That just saved the doctor a bit of time, as if they had their own assistant next to them.
Right.
Yeah,
right.
That's the type where I think you apply it to workflow. And that's where I get excited around where we're going as an industry, not just healthcare, but software, with this new interface, where by interpreting intent of the user, we can surface things up much more quickly, much more rapidly, and in a more natural workflow than we traditionally have with keywords or shifting of roles.
I hear this and I think, does this mean there are going to be fewer jobs, right? Because, hey, that was an assistant that you would have paid a human to do. Now your assistant is document chat, right? It's a few bucks a month of software. What do you think this is going to mean big picture for employment in the industry?
I think, like all shifts, it means change, and everyone gets very nervous about change, particularly change.
Change is bad.
We don't understand, right? Change is always bad. It's nervous. But then things pan out in the reality that we were really worried about the industrial age because people moved off of the farm and into big cities. And that somehow has worked out that we don't question our life these days in New York City to say, wow, is that bad or is that good? For some group of people, that became a new experience for them, and they built a life around that. Then we added on the internet, and we had access to all of this information out there. And that's brought its own set of challenges. But at the same time, I would say it's enhanced most of our lives. I think the same iteration will happen here, that for most of us, if you can put it in a practical workflow, it actually enhances what we can do and how much of it we can do. So I see it less of a taking away of jobs and more shifting what it is we do with a job all day.
What about what you said earlier? The different models will tell you different things. It's like different person's opinion reading the same document. And I understand that, if a lawyer read through a 200-page document, 10 lawyers would give you different opinions on what it says and what's possible and what it might mean and how you might proceed with a strategy. So I can see that same idea here going through these medical regulatory types of documents. But it, you don't think of it that way. Like the model themselves has an opinion, or, maybe this model is always a little more aggressive, or this one's always more conservative. So how do you deal with that? Do you have to average out a bunch of opinions? Do you go into all of them and create a spectrum of opinions? Because maybe a doctor or a pharmacist, they don't want 5 opinions. Maybe they do, right? But so how do you balance all of this?
Right. So I guess in my mind, I approach things maybe a little bit more physically, having come from classically being a manufacturing engineer, that I think of it like a car. When someone wants to make a new model of car, they tend not to build the engine. They buy an engine. The power plant comes from someone else, but they buy a power plant that meets the kind of needs of what they're looking for use. And then they build a whole interface around that power plant that is their car. That's their actual product. We're the same way with software. And so that's why in our early work with us this last year, we've really taken all those generative models and we made them all available, and we run them side by side to see who's better suited for this particular type of problem. And then we've actually become a little bit more nuance to it, we'll say this one might be better at coming up with the original response and sort of finding that intent correctly. But this one has a better, more polished silver tongue, that its diction, the way it explains it, is nicer. And we'll do a multi-part series. We'll have engine 1 find the solution, write it up, and engine 2 actually polish it up and present out the final product, kind of like having an editor on a book. Right. You got the author who wrote the main concept, and then the editor who really helps kind of polish it off.
Have you found, maybe you can't name names, but is there a model in particular that you like or don't like?
I'm probably not going to name names on that one because we do work strategic partnerships with large organizations, and I don't want to offend any partners. I just think that anyone who is not actually building the underlying models, where you aren't OpenAI, you aren't Anthropic, then you need to think of it as you've got a power plant. What kind of car are you going to build around it? And then a company like us, where our unique opportunities, we're just so connected with so much of the healthcare industry. We have all these little endpoints. We have the opportunity to bring it to workflow and basically make a practical solution that someone can go, oh, you solved this. Great, thanks. That helped.
How does it work? So is it fair to say that you do partner with companies like OpenAI, and then you're working, like you're building on top of their core work? Then the doctor pharmacist will be able to work off of that?
I'll take one that we can disclose as Amazon. We recently have partnered with them, and Amazon doesn't actually build the engine. They connect and create through their Bedrock platform an ecosystem of things like, now you can get to the Anthropic engine, where when I wrote Anthropic, they had just raised $1 billion and didn't have time for a company with a couple $100 million in revenue. And so with that, it allowed us to access more of it. No different than Hugging Face does allow you to go and access a whole host of models, and they've just made it easy. So we work with both folks like that, and we'll work more specifically with folks that have a particular model where they've perfected something. And then we have our internal group, our own data scientists, where they create their own models. And that's sort of our earliest products of ML, and that Smart Suite we alluded to in the beginning.
A lot of people think with the healthcare industry now that, let's say the typical, you go into the doctor's office or in the hospital, and the practitioner, the clinician, they're not looking at you. They're looking in the computer. They're just asking you questions, and they're just off to the side typing what you say in, and you're losing that human touch. Is that ever going to turn back around, where they can just look at you and talk to you? Or is it just going to keep going more and more to, I need to input all this data into the computer, and the computer is going to solve the answer?
So I might be biased from my last company, where we worked with digital intake for patients, to say it already has started to turn around. If you see the rise of retail clinics and urgent cares and how dramatic that was over the last decade, where it went from didn't much exist
It
to
just
now it's
totally took over.
available.
Yeah.
It was really took over, and it took over because of convenience, and it took over because people wanted access to healthcare, and they're having a hard time getting to it. And with that, we worked a lot at automating some of the workflows in there. And we found that it actually helped, because if you look at the staffing models in a lot of those, instead of having a MD provider with every single patient, they tend to have an RN, so a registered nurse with every single patient. And I think that that's what we ultimately end up getting as we adopt some of the AI technologies is, yes, things like ambient listening can make it a little bit more natural, or we don't have to go to the box and type in the box. And instead we can operate with the patient face to face and have a conversation like you and I are. That has its element. But I think the larger piece is, as we have more decision support by AI that is reliable, not necessarily doing the job, but helping with that initial triage, it allows us to really decide, do I really need a MD, or will an RN really cover this? Or maybe even a mid-level can handle that. Or how about just, I'm feeling bad and someone's got to pat my back and hold my hand. And so I think it allows us to help patients get to the right place of care with the right level expertise for their particular symptoms. I think that's one of the big effects you'll end up seeing.
I see. And then I'm just curious, because we mentioned at the very beginning, and maybe it's not an appropriate question for you, but I feel like I have to ask. When you talk about pharmacy and everything, and we're seeing all the news stories around the CVS, they're trying to change the pricing a little bit, and Mark Cuban's cost plus drugs, all of that. What are you paying attention to that? What are you seeing the impact of that in terms of, they're trying to simplify the industry, they're trying to make it a little bit better for consumers based on competition? Or do you see anything in that from your ecosystem?
So I think it's a big business. We are very aware of cost and price for patients, because we try and surface that up both to the provider at the time of prescribing as well as to the patient, so that they understand what it is. But I think it ends up, unfortunately, when you're feeling poorly, it's almost like a funeral home that has that casket sale. You really don't want to ever be buying a casket, but you have to. A lot of times drug therapies are that way. You hurt and you need some kind of resolve for it. So you're exceptionally sensitive to price, but it is one where you're probably not going to decline unless you absolutely can't afford it. And I don't think that there's a lot of similarities in the price shopping that we've had and some of the effects of maybe like an Amazon. I don't really see that in the future of the prescribing drug therapy world. Where I do see that is more on the access side, like in specialty medications, where it becomes a lot more complex of a problem, because often it's not just a straightforward prescription. There also has to be instructions involved of like, well, now I have this injectable thing that I'm supposed to do something with, and someone's got to teach me how to do it.
Right. It's not just a pill.
Right. Or I actually need a consent, even some of the more complex ones, where every single time you get a fill, you have to have a consent from a patient and a consent from the doctor.
I see.
Not just a prior auth of consent from the payer, but literally every time the patient says, I'm aware and I was given the right instruction.
Oh, I see. Fortunately, I haven't had to deal with those things yet in my life. So I'm not even, without personal experience, you don't realize all the different versions that this could play out with. What do you see in terms of like a year from now? If we're having this conversation at the end of 24, what changes do you think will actually happen in the medical industry that like normal people will see? Like the way that I think we really saw those urgent care clinics pop up all over the place. We really saw the way everyone started just typing into the box all the time. Those things that consumers and patients, it was just so obvious, those kind of trends that were changing. Do you think we're going to see obvious trends like that in the next year?
Yeah, I'm pretty excited about it. I think there's two different areas that we're going to see some immediate effects, not only just from our own company, but just industry wide. First is, I think you'll see the rise of, and we're trying to come up with the right words for it. So I go back to my early 90s AI where we had agents. I would consider it closer to an AI-enabled assistant or co-pilot that help with tasks in clinical workflow. And I think you'll see a lot of those starting out with a lot of ambient listening. Then and from that ambient listening, they'll sort of queue up various tasks that doctors have to do and save time. And that'll help providers overall. The second part that I'm really excited about, and our firm's doing some fun work on this, is around personalization. Not only is intent just to try and understand what it is you want, it also is around what you need and how you can hear it best. When we speak to people, we tend to modify our conversation thinking, what is the receiver, the one listening, how would they hear it best? Well, what if our medical instructions were that as well? And that's exactly what our firm's doing on our patient engagement side.
It's going to be interesting to see how things start to get better, because like you said, we're starting to see it turn back around where we had to rely on the technology, but we had to spend so much time with the technology. Now you're right. It's, can there be ambient listening? Can you just ask a question where it summarizes it for you? You know, those things that make it easier now to deal with it rather than us burying through 200 pages of documents. Any final thoughts before we go in terms of, you know, what you're excited to see, what challenge it still keeps you up at night? What's your kind of final takeaway here before we leave it?
On the final side, I don't know if this is the best final, but an area we didn't cover. I still think that we have, in our very distributed healthcare, we have an identity problem. And we're seeing this where, you know, from modern time on, as soon as they were script pads, people were trying to steal them to get access to prescriptions that they probably shouldn't have. That same problem exists in a digital world. And as we go to more and more digital interactions, whether it's telehealth, whether it's access of portals, and we want to have this exchange of information, it becomes more and more relevant. And I find that our firm's spending more and more time on the greater concept of identity and proving you are who you are, not just once, but all the time. And so I think
proving you are who you are, not just once, but all the time. That's a great phrase to summarize it like that.
And so I think that's where we're excited, and that'd be a whole nother conversation I could have on our 2RX efforts that we're working on. We're using mostly anomaly detection and outlier detection models in ML to identify users that are just so far out of a pattern. And that what's really neat about that is all unsupervised learning. So the AI is creating its own groups of users and saying, hey, this one's not quite right.
Yeah, there's so much. It's the things that you don't even think about. Right? You don't even think about it. Like, I didn't realize that was such a problem, right? That was such an issue.
It is. If you think about it, I tell internally, and hopefully our legal side won't be too unhappy, if you can compromise providers' identity on the illegal market, you can easily generate about $500,000 a week in illegal prescriptions. Oh, wow. So the business is not a couple of kids who are hanging out in mom's basement. No, this is high organized crime. And the sophistication that the pharmacies in particular are having to deal with, it's pretty amazing to where it's almost getting to state level actors most recently. And so and it's because it's a very, very large business.
Right, 500,000 a week is $25 million a year. I mean, that's
correct.
You're going to put in a lot of effort,
and you're going to have a lot of resources if you're successful at that. And so that's where we're always working with our partners to try and secure this space. That's where we came in with the controlled substance EPCS prescribing, where it has additional requirements. That's something we're really core to. Now we're getting a little bit predictive on that by truly watching the users and the prescriptions with our outlier detection models and sort of flagging them and saying, like, I can't say this is bad, but you should probably have a look.
Right. Give it an extra pair of eyes on this one. We've got the model is noticing some things that stand. It's very similar to, you know, with banks and money laundering and a lot of the same kind of issues that you see there with what exactly is going on.
And it's the same types of technology. And Like, we've been running this for about a year and a half, been with good success internally, but literally a paper that was published last year, a single paper, that particular model that the researchers worked on, we applied that. A couple of our data scientists had picked it up, and that made all the difference in the world. And we just jumped how much better we are at it.
Amazing. Amazing.
So it really goes quickly, the adaptation of what's possible.
This is amazing. Anthony, thank you so much. I appreciate you opening my eyes to things that are happening, typically behind the scenes, that you don't realize all the technology going on from what's happening in the industry, in the technology, to make the process better for people, right? To get to a better outcome, better patient experience, better health for people, right? That's the whole point of all of this. So Anthony, thank you so much. You're doing great work, and look forward to talking to you again soon.
Eric, it's been a pleasure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you to my guest, and thanks for listening. Subscribe to get the latest episodes each week, and we'll see you next time.